we need to talk about what just surfaced. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this could be one of the most significant document dumps we've seen in years. Newly unsealed court records related to Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender and trafficker who died under suspicious circumstances in federal custody, have just been made public. And Donald Trump's name appears in these documents more than 1,000 times. Let me repeat that, more than 1,000 times. These aren't passing mentions. These aren't footnotes. This is a pattern of association, of presence, of connection to one of the most notorious criminals in modern American history, now laid out in black and white in federal court documents. And here's what makes this moment so critical. Trump is currently running for president. Again. He's the front-runner for the Republican nomination. He's holding rallies, raising money, and telling his supporters that he's the victim of political persecution. But these documents don't come from his political opponents. They don't come from the media. They come from sealed court records that a federal judge determined the public has a right to see. This isn't a witch hunt. This is the legal system doing exactly what it's supposed to do, bringing truth to light. The timing couldn't be more consequential. As Trump faces 91 criminal charges across 4 separate indictments as he deals with civil fraud trials and defamation cases, now we have this. A massive trove of evidence connecting him repeatedly to Jeffrey Epstein's world. And the American people deserve to know exactly what these documents reveal. Let's break down what we're actually looking at here. A federal judge in New York ordered the unsealing of previously confidential documents related to a civil lawsuit involving Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime associate, who is currently serving 20 years in prison for sex trafficking. These documents include depositions, witness statements, flight logs, phone records, and testimony that had been kept under seal for years. The release was part of an ongoing effort toward transparency in cases involving Epstein's crimes and his network of associates. And when legal analysts and journalists started combing through these thousands of pages, one name kept appearing over and over and over again: Donald Trump. We're talking about mentions in witness testimony, references in documents about parties, events, and private gatherings, details about phone calls and meetings, records of flights and social connections. This isn't one or two coincidental mentions. This is a documented pattern spanning years. Now, Trump and his defenders will immediately pivot to their standard playbook. They'll claim he barely knew Epstein. They'll say he kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago years ago. They'll insist this is all old news being weaponized for political purposes. But here's where this gets serious. The sheer volume of mentions in these legal documents tells a very different story than the sanitized version Trump has tried to sell the public. These are under-oath testimonies. These are contemporaneous records. These are facts presented in a legal context where lying has consequences. The documents detail a social relationship that went far beyond casual acquaintance. They reference multiple instances of Trump and Epstein attending events together, sharing social circles in Palm Beach and New York, and maintaining contact over an extended period. Several witnesses describe seeing them together at parties. Phone records show repeated contact, and perhaps most significantly, multiple testimonies describe Trump's presence at locations and events that are central to understanding Epstein's operation and his access to powerful people. Here's where this becomes impossible to ignore. We're not just talking about a former president having once known a bad person. We're talking about someone currently seeking the highest office in the land being repeatedly connected in federal court documents to one of the most prolific sex traffickers in American history. Someone who exploited young women and girls. Someone whose crimes were enabled by wealth, power, and connections to people exactly like Donald Trump. And this is where everything changes. Trump has spent years crafting a narrative that he's the outsider, the truth teller, the guy who's going to drain the swamp. But these documents place him firmly inside one of the darkest swamps imaginable. They show a man who moved in the exact circles, attended the exact parties, and maintained the exact friendships that enabled Epstein to operate with impunity for decades. The political implications are staggering. Trump is asking voters to trust him with the presidency again. He's asking for control of the Department of Justice, the FBI, intelligence agencies, and the full power of the executive branch. But how can the American people grant that trust when over 1,000 mentions in Epstein-related court documents raise serious questions about his judgment, his associations, and what he knew about Epstein's activities? This isn't about guilt by association in some abstract sense. This is about a documented pattern of proximity to criminal activity. It's about being named repeatedly in legal testimony related to one of the most significant sex trafficking cases in modern history. And it's about the character and integrity of someone who wants to lead this country. The legal exposure here extends beyond just reputation. While Trump hasn't been charged in connection with Epstein's crimes, these documents create a roadmap for future investigations. They establish timelines. They identify potential witnesses. They create a documentary record that prosecutors, investigators, and journalists can use to ask harder questions and demand real answers. Let's talk about what's actually in these documents, because the details matter. Multiple depositions reference Trump's presence at Epstein's properties, including his Manhattan mansion and his estate in Palm Beach. Witnesses describe seeing Trump at social gatherings where young women were present, gatherings that we now know were part of Epstein's larger pattern of abuse and exploitation. Flight logs, which have been examined by multiple news organizations, show connections between Trump's travel patterns and Epstein's movements during certain periods in the 1990s and early 2000s. Phone records indicate frequent contact. And perhaps most tellingly, several witnesses describe the nature of the Trump-Epstein relationship as close, social, and ongoing, not distant or merely professional. One particular set of testimonies describes parties at Mar-a-Lago, where Epstein was a regular guest, and where he allegedly brought young women he claimed were models or friends. Multiple witnesses placed Trump at these same events. Now, we know from Epstein's conviction and from Ghislaine Maxwell's trial that models and friends were often code words for victims. The documents don't explicitly accuse Trump of knowing about or participating in criminal activity, but they establish beyond doubt that he was present in environments where that activity was occurring. There's also documented evidence of the two men's business discussions. Records show they explored potential real estate deals together. They attended the same high-profile events in New York and Florida. They moved in overlapping social circles that included other wealthy, powerful men, some of whom have since been implicated in Epstein's crimes or called to testify about their own relationships with him. What makes this documentation so significant is its legal weight. These aren't tabloid rumors. These aren't anonymous sources. These are sworn depositions given under penalty of perjury. These are contemporaneous records created at the time events occurred. This is evidence that has been deemed credible enough to remain part of official federal court proceedings. And here's what should terrify Trump's legal team. This is just one document release. Federal judges are continuing to unseal Epstein-related materials as part of ongoing transparency efforts and litigation. More documents are expected. More names are expected to surface. More details about Epstein's network and the powerful men who enabled him are coming to light. This exposes a much bigger problem for Trump's presidential campaign. Every news cycle dominated by his connections to Epstein is a news cycle where he's not talking about the economy or immigration or whatever message his campaign wants to push. Every interview where he has to answer questions about these documents is an opportunity for him to either lie, which creates legal exposure, or tell the truth, which creates political exposure. The timeline is tightening in another way, too. We're heading into primary season. Republican voters are about to make a choice about who they want as their nominee. And while Trump's base has proven remarkably loyal through scandal after scandal, there's a difference between defending him against the deep state and defending his repeated mentions in documents connected to a child sex trafficker. Even the most committed partisan has to reconcile that reality. Behind the scenes, Trump's legal strategy is becoming increasingly complicated. He's already dealing with multiple criminal trials scheduled for this year. He's facing hundreds of millions in potential civil judgments. His legal fees are astronomical. And now he has to prepare for intense scrutiny of his Epstein connections, scrutiny that could lead to new investigations, new subpoenas, and new legal jeopardy. We're also seeing panic in his public statements. Trump has gone from barely acknowledging Epstein to actively trying to distance himself, claiming he was not a fan and that he threw him out of Mar-a-Lago. But these documents undermine that narrative. They show a relationship that lasted years, that involved multiple interactions, and that placed Trump in the same rooms where Epstein's crimes were being facilitated. The institutional consequences are real too. Media organizations are now combing through every page of these documents. Investigative journalists are cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. Advocacy groups are demanding answers. And prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions are likely taking a fresh look at whether there are angles they previously missed. So where does this go from here? Legally, Trump faces several potential scenarios. Best case for him, these documents remain historical artifacts that damage his reputation but don't lead to new charges. He survives politically by convincing his base this is all a smear campaign, and enough voters either don't care or don't believe it matters. Worst case, these documents become the foundation for new investigations. Prosecutors use the information to identify witnesses who can testify about what Trump knew and when he knew it. New evidence emerges that creates criminal exposure. The political damage becomes insurmountable, even among Republicans who've stood by him through everything else. The most likely scenario falls somewhere in between. These documents will continue to generate headlines throughout the campaign. They'll be cited in attack ads. They'll come up in debates. They'll force Trump to answer uncomfortable questions at every campaign stop. And they'll give voters one more piece of information to weigh when deciding whether this man deserves to be president again. From a political standpoint, this is a disaster that keeps unfolding. Trump can't make these documents disappear. He can't intimidate a federal judge into resealing them. He can't sue his way out of publicly available court records. All he can do is try to spin the narrative, and that becomes harder with every new detail that emerges. The Republican Party also has to grapple with this reality. They're preparing to potentially nominate someone who appears more than 1,000 times in documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operation. That's not a peripheral issue. That's not background noise. That's a massive vulnerability in a general election, where independent voters and moderate Republicans might finally draw a line they won't cross. And let's be clear about what this means for American democracy. We're watching in real time how power and wealth can insulate people from accountability. Epstein operated for decades with impunity, enabled by connections to men like Trump. Even after Epstein's arrest and death, the full scope of his network remains partially hidden. These document releases are steps toward accountability, but they also reveal how much we still don't know. What we're witnessing is a moment of reckoning that Trump cannot avoid, cannot spin away, and cannot intimidate into silence. Over 1,000 mentions in federal court documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. That's not a political attack. That's a documented reality that every American voter deserves to understand fully. The documents are public, the facts are established, the timeline is clear, and the questions about judgment, about character, about fitness for office demand answers that go beyond rally speeches and social media attacks. As more documents get unsealed, as journalists continue investigating, and as the American people head toward another presidential election, this story will continue to evolve. The truth has a way of emerging, especially when it's preserved in federal court records that no amount of bluster or intimidation can erase. Trump has built his political career on the claim that he's different from the establishment, that he can't be bought, that he tells it like it is. But these Epstein documents tell a very different story, one of proximity to power at its most corrupt, of associations with a predator, of being exactly the kind of insider he claims to oppose. The American people will ultimately decide whether that matters. But they deserve to make that decision with full knowledge of what these documents reveal. More than 1,000 mentions isn't background noise. It's a pattern. And patterns tell us who people really are. Stay informed. This story is far from over. And the next revelation could be even more damaging than what we've already seen.